The year was 1881, and the wind that swept across the plains near Providence Creek carried with it the grit of judgment. It was a fine, sharp dust that settled on everything, coating window panes and spirits alike, and no one felt its abrasive touch more keenly than Eleanor Vance. For a year, she had been a widow. For that same year she had been an island, surrounded by a sea of polite nods and whispered condemnations. Her husband, Arthur, had been a good man, a sensible man, but his death had not only taken her partner, it had stripped her of her place. A woman alone was a problem the town did not know how to solve, and so they chose instead to resent her for it. Her days fell into a rhythm of stark necessity. She tended the small plot of land Arthur had carved from the unyielding earth, her hands, once soft, now calloused and capable. She kept to herself, her trips into the town for supplies brief and silent affairs. She would stand at the counter of Blackwood's Mercantile, her gaze fixed on the flour sack or the block of salt, feeling the weight of eyes on her back. Amos Blackwood, a man whose piety was as starched as his collar, would tally her purchases with a grin set to his jaw, as if her very presence was a debt against the town's moral ledger. Loneliness was a physical thing, a constant companion that sat beside her at the supper table and lay beside her in the cold, empty bed. It was in the silence of the cabin, a silence so profound she could hear the beat of her own heart, a lonely drum in a vast, empty wilderness. Grief, she had learned, was not a storm that passed, but a landscape one was forced to inhabit. The sharp peaks of initial sorrow had softened into rolling hills of melancholy, a permanent geography of her soul. She had become resigned to it, to this life of quiet desperation, believing it was all that was left for her. The town saw a stubborn, aloof woman. They did not see the woman who wept into her pillow at night, not for what she had lost, but for the utter emptiness of what she now had. One evening, as a bruised twilight bled across the sky, a storm rolled in, not with the lazy rumble of summer, but the violent crack of a whip. Rain came down in sheets, turning her small yard to a sea of mud. It was in the brief, trembling quiet, after a particularly loud clap of thunder, that she heard a sound that did not belong to the storm. It was a low groan, an animal sound of pure pain, and it came from the direction of the creek that bordered her property. Caution was a widow's closest friend, but something in that sound tugged at a part of her she thought had long since withered. Pulling her late husband's oilskin coat over her shoulders, she lit a lantern, its flickering flame a tiny, defiant star against the raging dark. The wind fought her, trying to extinguish the light, trying to drive her back into the safety of her cabin. But she pushed on, her boots sinking into the grasping mud, the sound pulling her forward. She found him at the water's edge, half submerged in the churning creek. He was a native man, his bare chest slick with rain and blood that flowed from a vicious gash on his side. An arrow, broken but still lodged, protruded from his shoulder. His face, framed by long, wet black hair, was taut with agony, but his eyes, when they flickered open and met hers, held not fear, but a fierce, unbroken pride. He was a warrior, she saw that instantly, and in this part of the country, a warrior of his people was a danger second only to God's own wrath in the eyes of the townsfolk. Every instinct of self-preservation screamed at her to turn back, to leave him to the storm and the creek. To help him was to invite a ruin far greater than the social ostracism she already endured. It was an act of treason, but as she stood there, the lantern light dancing over his strong, wounded form, she saw not the savage of Amos Blackwood's sermons. She saw a man, bleeding and broken, on the verge of dying on her land. The emptiness inside her, the vast, silent landscape of her grief, suddenly contained a single, sharp point of focus. To leave him would be to let the final, tender part of her own humanity die with him. In that moment, Eleanor Vance made a choice. She waded into the cold, rushing water, the lantern held high, and with a strength born of a year of solitary hardship, she began the impossible task of saving him. Getting him from the creek to the barn was a trial of fire and water. He was heavy, a dead weight of muscle and bone, and his intermittent groans were a constant, grim reminder of his state. She half dragged, half carried him across the sodden ground, the rain plastering her hair to her face and soaking her to the bone. The barn, at least, offered sanctuary. Its air was thick with the scent of hay and dry earth, a stark contrast to the storm's fury. She laid him gently on a bed of clean straw in an empty stall, his breath coming in shallow, ragged gasps. For a long moment, she just stood there, catching her own breath, the reality of her decision settling upon her like a shroud. In her barn lay the very embodiment of the town's deepest fears and prejudices. If he were found, they would not ask for explanations. Her quiet shunning would become a roaring fire of condemnation. They would call her a traitor, a sympathizer, a woman of loose morals. They would destroy her. Yet, looking down at him, a flicker of defiance sparked within her. Let them. What more could they take from her? Her husband was gone. Her standing in the community was a fiction. This act, this dangerous, reckless act of compassion, was the first thing she had done in a year that felt entirely her own. Working by the steady glow of the lantern, she began to tend to his wounds. Her hands, though trembling, were surprisingly steady. She tore strips from one of Arthur's old shirts, her heart clenching for a moment at the memory before she pushed it away. The water she fetched was clean, and she gently washed the grime and blood from the deep cut in his side. It was a knife wound, clean and deep. The arrow was a more complicated matter. She knew enough to understand that pulling it out carelessly could do more harm than good. The head was lightly barbed. He was conscious through most of it, his dark eyes following her every move. He did not speak, nor did he cry out, even when she probed the angry flesh around the arrowhead. A stoicism was etched into his features, a discipline of pain that she, in her own way, understood. There was a language in their silence. Her careful, gentle motions spoke of a desire to heal, not to harm. His stillness, his endurance, spoke of a trust he had no reason to give, but was offering all the same. Finally, after what felt like hours, she decided the arrow had to come out. "This will hurt," she whispered, the words feeling loud and clumsy in the quiet barn. She wasn't sure if he understood her words, but he seemed to understand her intent. His jaw tightened, and he gave a short, sharp nod. Taking a deep breath, she broke the shaft further, gripped the embedded portion, and pulled. It came free with a sickening sound of tearing flesh. For a single, terrifying moment, he arched his back, a silent scream contorting his features, and then he collapsed back into the straw, unconscious. Blood welled up, dark and frightening, but she pressed a clean cloth to the wound, applying pressure until, slowly, mercifully, the bleeding subsided. She packed the wound with a poultice of yarrow she kept for her own cuts and scrapes, then bandaged his shoulder and his side as best she could. Exhausted, she sank back on her heels, the adrenaline leaving her weak and trembling. The storm outside had lessened to a steady, drumming rain. The Mantha warrior was breathing deeply now, lost in a healing sleep. She stayed there for a long time, watching the rise and fall of his chest, a silent sentinel in the lantern-lit dark. The silence in the barn was different from the silence in her cabin. It was not empty. It was filled with a shared breath, a shared secret, a fragile life she had pulled back from the brink. For the first time in a year, Eleanor Vance was not entirely alone. The days that followed fell into a new, secret rhythm. Her life became a study in deception, a careful dance between two worlds. The first was the world outside the barn, the one of a solitary widow going about her chores under the watchful eye of the prairie sky. The second was the hidden world within the barn, a place of whispered words and shared silence, of healing and hesitant connection. Each morning, she would rise before the sun, tend to her small flock of chickens, and milk her cow, casting furtive glances toward the barn. Then she would prepare a small meal broth, a piece of bread, a cup of water, and carry it, concealed in her basket, to her patient. He was often awake when she arrived, his dark eyes tracking her from his bed of straw. He never spoke at first, merely accepting the food with a quiet nod of thanks. His name, he eventually told her, in a voice raspy from disuse, was Chaitan. It meant falcon. The name suited him. There was a sharpness to his gaze, an awareness of his surroundings that missed nothing, even in his weakened state. Eleanor, in turn, found herself speaking to him, her words filling the quiet space that had so long oppressed her. She told him about her garden, about the stubbornness of the soil, about the way the morning glories clung to the fence. She spoke of Arthur, not with the sharp pain of fresh grief, but with a soft, remembered fondness. She was not seeking absolution or even understanding. She was simply breaking the dam of her own silence, letting the stories spill out into the safe harbor of the barn. Chaitan would listen, his expression unreadable but his attention absolute. He was a keeper of secrets, she realized, both his own and, now, hers. As his strength returned, the dynamic between them began to shift. He was no longer just a patient. One afternoon she entered the barn to find him sitting up, painstakingly sharpening her dull axe with a whetstone he had found. The rhythmic scrape of stone on steel was a strangely comforting sound. Another day, he had taken the liberty of mending a broken hinge on the stall door, his large hands surprisingly deft. He was repaying his debt in the only way he could, with small acts of service that eased her burdens in ways she hadn't realized they existed. One evening, as she brought him his supper, he gestured for her to sit. He had been working with a small piece of wood, and now he held it out to her. It was a bird, carved with intricate detail, its wings swept back as if in flight. A falcon. She took it, her fingers tracing the smooth, careful lines. It was a beautiful, unexpected gift. "You have a strong heart," Chaitan said, his voice low and steady, like a prairie bird in a storm. Eleanor looked at him, truly looked at him, not as a wounded man or a dangerous secret, but as the person who saw her. He did not see a pitiable widow or a social pariah. He saw strength. Tears pricked her eyes, hot and sudden. "No one has called me strong in a long time," she whispered. "They do not see," he replied simply. In that moment, the final wall of her reserve crumbled. She began to see him too. She saw the lines of sorrow around his eyes, the deep well of dignity within him. He told her in clipped, spare sentences of the battle with a rival tribe, of being separated from his party, of the men who had pursued him. He spoke of his people, the Lakota, not as faceless savages, but as families, as a community he longed to return to. His loss was as profound as hers, a different shape, but the same heavy weight. They were two solitary souls from different worlds, shipwrecked on the same shore of grief and isolation, finding a strange and unexpected solace in each other's company. The days grew warmer, and the prairie bloomed with a fierce, short-lived beauty. Inside the barn, a fragile bloom of a different kind was unfolding. The space between them, once filled with caution, was now charged with a quiet intimacy. A shared glance held a whole conversation. The brush of their hands as she passed him a bowl of stew sent a jolt through her that was both terrifying and exhilarating. She had forgotten what it felt like to be seen by a man, not with pity or judgment, but with respect and something more, something that smoldered in the depths of his dark eyes. She knew it was impossible. She knew it was madness, but the heart, long dormant, had begun to beat again, and it did not care for reason or the rules of a world that had already cast her out. The inevitable arrived on a Tuesday, carried on the wings of petty gossip. Eleanor had needed to go to town for flour and sugar, a trip she had put off for as long as possible. The air in Blackwood's mercantile was thicker than usual with unspoken accusation. Amos Blackwood's wife, a woman with a face like a dried apple, watched her with narrowed eyes. "You're buying more than usual, Eleanor," Martha Blackwood observed, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "A woman living alone hardly needs so much flour." "I enjoy baking," Eleanor replied, her voice steady, her heart hammering against her ribs. "Or perhaps you have company," the woman pressed. "Jedediah's boy said he saw smoke coming from your chimney at odd hours, and lights in the barn." The blood drained from Eleanor's face. She fumbled with her coin purse, her hands suddenly clumsy. She paid for her goods and fled, the woman's venomous gaze burning a hole in her back. She ran the wagon hard on the way home, a cold dread coiling in her stomach. They knew. They did not know what they knew, but their suspicion had found a focus. When she burst into the barn, Chayton was already on his feet, his posture tense. He had heard the wagon's frantic approach. "What is it?" he asked, his hand instinctively going to the knife he always kept at his belt. She told him everything, the words tumbling out in a panicked rush. "They suspect something. It's not safe for you here anymore. You have to go." The words felt like stones in her mouth. The thought of the silence returning, deeper and more absolute than before, was unbearable. He looked at her, his gaze intense. He saw the fear in her eyes, but he also saw the sorrow. He stepped closer, reaching out to gently cup her face in his hand. His touch was warm and steadying. "They will hurt you because of me," he said. It was not a question. "I don't care," she said, the lie tasting bitter even as she said it. Of course she cared. She was terrified. "I do," he replied, his thumb stroking her cheek. "I will not bring this trouble to your door." He looked around the barn, the small sanctuary that had saved him. "You saved my life, Eleanor Vance. I will not repay that debt by causing your death." He was fully healed now, his movements fluid and powerful. He was a warrior again. He gathered the few things he had: the knife, the carved falcon which he pressed back into her hand, and prepared to leave. "Where will you go?" she asked, her voice choked. "Home, to my people." He paused, his eyes holding hers. "I will come back for you." She wanted to believe him, but the prairie was vast and unforgiving. The distance between their worlds felt insurmountable. "It's too far," she whispered. "No distance is too far," he said with a certainty that stole her breath. He leaned in, and for a fleeting, wondrous moment, his lips brushed against hers. It was not a kiss of passion, but of promise, a solemn seal on an unspoken vow. Then, as silently as a shadow, he was gone, melting into the tall prairie grass behind the barn. Eleanor stood alone, the carved bird clutched in her hand, the ghost of his touch on her lips. The silence that descended was no longer just empty, it was heavy with loss. The town's suspicion, which had been a simmering pot, now boiled over. Chayton's departure did not save her. In their eyes, it only confirmed her guilt. His absence was proof that he had been there, and she, Eleanor Vance, the widow, had harbored him. She had betrayed her own kind, and Providence Creek was not a town that believed in forgiveness. It believed in punishment. The town's verdict was delivered not by a judge or a jury, but by a mob. They came for her 2 nights after Chayton left, their faces illuminated by the sinister, dancing light of torches. Amos Blackwood was at their head, his face a mask of righteous fury, the Bible held in his hand like a weapon. They dragged her from her cabin, her terrified protests lost in their jeers and accusations. "Harlot," one woman shrieked. "Indian lover," a man spat, his face contorted with hate. They were a monstrous choir of sanctimony, their voices rising in the night. They tied her to the public posting board in the center of town, the rough wood scraping her back. For the rest of that night and all through the next day, she was made a spectacle. Children were encouraged to throw rotting vegetables. Women who had once offered her condolences now hurled insults. Men stood by, their arms crossed, their faces hard and unforgiving, as if her humiliation somehow affirmed their own virtue. Eleanor endured it. She retreated into herself, into the silent, fortified place she had built during her year of widowhood. She closed her eyes and saw Chayton's face, heard his promise. "I will come back for you." It became a mantra, a shield against their hate. Her silence, her refusal to break or beg, only enraged them further. She was denying them their victory, the satisfaction of her submission. On the morning of the second day, Blackwood declared that her silent defiance was an affront to God and the community. A more permanent lesson was required. They brought a bucket of hot, bubbling tar, the acrid smell filling the air. Feathers, plucked from countless chickens, were stuffed into sacks. Fear, cold and sharp, finally pierced Eleanor's defenses. This was a primal, ancient cruelty, a stripping away of not just dignity, but of humanity itself. They ripped the top of her dress, exposing her shoulders and back. The crowd grew quiet now, their bloodlust mixed with a horrified fascination. This was the precipice. Blackwood took the ladle himself, his eyes gleaming with a zealot's fire. "Let this be a mark upon you," he intoned, his voice booming across the square. "The mark of a woman who chose a heathen over her own people." The hot tar hit her skin with an agony so profound it stole her breath. It was a searing, liquid fire that clung and burned, and she screamed, a raw, ragged sound torn from the depths of her soul. Another ladleful followed, and another. The pain was all-consuming, a universe of torment. Then came the feathers, thrown by the handful, sticking to the hot tar, a grotesque parody of a bird's plumage. Her vision tunneled, the jeering faces of the crowd blurring into a hazy nightmare. Through the agony, she held on to one thought, one image: Chaitin, a falcon in flight. And then a new sound cut through the air. It was a low, resonant cry from the ridge overlooking the town, a sound that made the blood run cold. It was answered by another and another, until the air vibrated with it. The crowd froze. All heads turned toward the ridge. Standing there, silhouetted against the morning sun, was a line of riders. They were not settlers or cowboys. They were warriors, their forms painted for war, their lances catching the light. At their center, mounted on a powerful black horse, was Chaitin. He was no longer a wounded refugee. He was a leader, a chieftain, his presence radiating an authority that dwarfed Amos Blackwood's self-righteous posturing. For a long moment, the two groups faced each other across the small valley the town, suddenly small and pathetic, and the silent, imposing line of Lakota warriors. The bravado of the mob evaporated, replaced by a primal, stomach-churning fear. They had tormented one woman. He had returned with an army. Then, with a single sharp cry, Chaitin urged his horse forward. The warriors followed, not with a chaotic charge, but with a disciplined, inexorable advance. They flowed down the ridge like a river of judgment, their ponies' hooves a thunderous drumbeat that sounded the town's doom. They did not slow as they reached the town's edge, pouring into the main street, surrounding the square. The townsfolk scattered, scrambling for cover, their courage melting away like snow in a fire. Only Amos Blackwood stood his ground, though his face had gone pale and his hand trembled on the cover of his Bible. Chaitin brought his horse to a halt directly in front of him. He dismounted, his movements fluid and deliberate. He was taller than Blackwood, his presence more powerful than any sermon. He did not speak. He did not need to. His eyes, filled with a cold, controlled fury, said everything. He looked from Blackwood's terrified face to the horrific sight of Eleanor, slumped and broken against the post. A flicker of immense pain crossed his features, quickly replaced by a resolve as hard as flint. He walked past Blackwood as if he were nothing more than a stone, drawing his knife. For a heart-stopping second, the remaining onlookers thought he would kill the preacher. Instead, he went to Eleanor. With two swift, precise cuts, he severed the ropes that bound her wrists. She collapsed forward, and he caught her, gathering her into his arms. The crowd could see the raw, burned skin beneath the tar and feathers, and for the first time, a flicker of collective shame was visible on some of their faces. Chaitin gently pulled the heavy woolen blanket from his own shoulders and wrapped it around her, covering her violated body, hiding her from their prying eyes. He lifted her as if she weighed nothing. Cradling her against his chest, he turned to face Blackwood and the terrified remnants of his town. His voice, when he finally spoke, was not a shout. It was low, clear, and carried the weight of absolute command. "This woman showed me kindness when your people would have shown me death," he said, his gaze sweeping over them. "You call her a sinner, I call her my wife." He paused, letting the words sink in, letting the full weight of their transgression settle upon them. "You have shamed her, but you have shamed yourselves more. You will not see her again, and you will pray to your God that we do not see you again." Without another word, he carried Eleanor to his horse, mounted, and settled her in front of him. He gave a sharp command in his own tongue, and the warriors turned, parting to let him through. They moved as one, a silent, powerful tide, flowing back out of the town, leaving behind a stunned silence, the lingering smell of tar, and the profound, indelible stain of their own cruelty. As they rode toward the ridge back toward the open plains, Eleanor, drifting in a haze of pain and relief, leaned her head against Chaitan's chest and felt, for the first time in her life, that she was truly going home. The journey was a blur of pain and dreamlike consciousness. Eleanor drifted in and out of awareness, anchored to reality only by the steady strength of Chaitan's arms around her and the rhythmic gait of the horse beneath them. The world was reduced to sensation, the warmth of his body against her back, the soft wool of the blanket against her cheek, the cool wind on her face. Her own body was a distant country of agony, but he was her shield against it. When the pain became too great, one of his warriors would ride close and press a waterskin to her lips containing a bitter, herbal liquid that would pull her back under the gentle waves of sleep. They stopped often. During these rests, Chaitan would tend to her with a gentleness that seemed almost impossible in a man so formidable. With the help of an older woman from his tribe, a woman with kind, knowing eyes, they began the slow, torturous process of cleaning the tar from her skin. They used animal fats and soft cloths, working with painstaking patience. Every touch was a fresh wave of fire, but it was a fire of healing, not of hate. In those moments, lying by a small fire under a vast, star-filled sky, surrounded by the quiet murmurs of the Lakota language, she felt the layers of her old life being peeled away along with the tar. The shame they had tried to brand her with was being cleansed by hands that offered only care. They arrived at the village as the sun was setting, painting the sky in hues of orange and rose. It was not a fortress of savages, but a sprawling, living community of hide lodges, nestled in a river valley, sheltered by cottonwood trees. Smoke from cookfires rose in lazy columns, and the sounds of children laughing and dogs barking filled the air. This was Chaitan's home, a place of life and connection that stood in stark contrast to the rigid, fearful silence of Providence Creek. He carried her to his lodge, the largest in the center of the village. Inside it was warm and spacious, the firelight dancing on painted hides that depicted hunts and battles. The older woman, whose name she learned was Wachiwi, or Dancing Woman, continued her care. She applied soothing salves of crushed leaves and roots to Eleanor's burns, her touch firm but compassionate. She did not speak English, but her actions spoke a universal language of healing and welcome. In the weeks that followed, Eleanor healed. Her physical wounds slowly scarred over, the angry red fading to a pale network of lines on her shoulders and back. But it was her spirit that underwent the more profound transformation. The brittle shell of the widow Vance, the woman defined by what she had lost and how she was judged, cracked and fell away. In its place, someone new began to emerge. She learned to find her place in the rhythm of the village. She learned words in their language, the names of tools, of foods, of people. She learned to grind corn with the other women, her hands growing strong in a new way. They taught her to bead, their fingers flying in intricate patterns, telling stories with color and shape. They did not pity her, they accepted her. She was Chaitan's wife, the woman he had ridden through fire to claim, and that earned her a respect that had nothing to do with her past or the color of her skin. It had to do with her heart, which Chaitan had told them was strong. With Chaitan, she found a partnership she had never known. It was a connection forged not in polite society, but in shared trauma and fierce loyalty. They built a life in the quiet moments, in the way he would bring her a wildflower he found while hunting, in the way she would mend a tear in his moccasins. They would sit together by the fire in the evenings, and he would tell her the stories of the stars, stories his father had told him. She, in turn, would tell him about the ocean she had seen once as a child, a body of water so vast it mirrored the sky. They were discovering each other's landscapes, both inner and outer. One cool evening, months after her arrival, she stood with him on a small hill overlooking the sleeping village. The scars on her back ached with the cold, a faint reminder of the life she had left behind. She absently touched the small carved falcon that she now wore on a leather cord around her neck. "Do you ever miss it?" Chayton asked, his voice a low rumble beside her. He did not need to specify what he meant. Eleanor considered the question. She thought of her small cabin, the lonely fields, the judgmental eyes of Providence Creek. She thought of the suffocating silence. That world felt like a dream from which she had woken. "I miss my husband's memory," she said honestly, "and my garden, but I do not miss the loneliness." She turned to look at him, at his strong profile illuminated by the rising moon. "Here," she said, her voice soft with a truth that filled her entire being, "I am not lonely." He reached out, his fingers gently tracing the line of her jaw. His gaze held a universe of love and respect. He had seen her at her most broken, at her most humiliated, and he had not turned away. He had seen her strength when she thought she had none left. He had not just saved her life, he had given her a new one. He leaned down and kissed her, a slow, deep kiss of profound belonging. It was a kiss that healed the last of her wounds, the invisible ones etched upon her soul. The wind that swept through the river valley was clean and free. It carried the scent of wood smoke and sage, the promise of a shared future. Wrapped in his arms, under the infinite, watchful eyes of the stars, Eleanor Vance, who had been a widow and an outcast, finally understood the meaning of home.